There I am. See if anybody else can come on. Maybe. There's Caleb. What's up, buddy?
Hey. Howdy,
How
howdy.
goes it? And there's Jimmy.
There we are. There we are.
The cold weather's slowing down our internet.
Well, and one of us isn't as smart as he likes to think people think he is.
Hey, don't talk about me like that.
Oh, man. Well, good evening, fellas.
Howdy.
Howdy. I think as we talk, I'm going to move over to my laptop because I'm trying to do this on my iPad, but I just cannot hear very well. So we'll keep talking
Okay.
and I'll work it out. Got my
It's 'cause
volume up
Mother
all the way.
Mother Nature and I are going to have to find a dark alley and fight this out because I've had it with her. If it's Sunday or Wednesday, the weather's going to be suspect. And we just need to take a brawl for it all and get it over with.
All I know is it was 75 degrees when I left Georgia, and now it's 22 degrees in Texas. So I don't like this.
It was the mid 70s on Monday. I mean, it was.
It got up to 80.
Did it? I thought it had touched 80, but I wasn't sure. So I didn't want to be that guy. So, good evening, Viviana. Good to see you. And Miss Tanya.
Give me just a second.
Samuel. And there's the Mother Slinkard. Good to see you. Rick, thank you for being with us tonight. So I'm learning how to operate on my iPad. So I thought the iPad would be a little easier on my internet bandwidth. So we'll see. But it's good to see you, Caleb. You guys had a good time at the wedding?
We did. It was a good time.
It looked like a good time. That's awesome. That's awesome.
It was supposed to be outside, but it quickly got moved inside. But it was nice. I've known Carrie for over a decade.
Ever?
I got to see a bunch of people.
You guys go all the way back to Commerce?
Yeah. We all went to school together.
And
that is much better.
Brother? Now,
Man,
Jason,
I had it on my iPad. I just couldn't hear anything.
He's used to some cold and some snow. It's good and cold where Jason is this evening. So I can't tell if Josh is hearing us yet.
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, there he is. Okay.
I can hear
These
you.
long, pregnant pauses. So,
well, I don't know. I mean, I was gonna use my iPad. It's a lot newer of a machine, but I can't. I mean, I could barely hear anything on there. I don't know what the issue is. But they need to have a StreamYard app for the iPad.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that'd probably be good. I opted for earbuds, so that may be why my.
Well, that's what I got.
Look, I'm as cool as Josh. So. Oh my goodness! So the wind is brutal. I bet it is. There's not much to break that wind up out there. So
wasn't around this time last year when it got super cold in Texas?
It was last week.
Yeah.
Snowmageddon was last week. So
here we go.
This is what we do know: is the groundhog knows his stuff. Don't ever bet against the groundhog. Now, we're talking about Punxsutawney Phil, not all of the second Johnny-come-latelys. We're talking about the original.
Yeah, I never even
speaks to God.
I never even heard of all the rest of them until this year. There's one in like New Jersey.
No,
one of them died. One of them died like the day before Groundhog Day. One of the groundhogs, and they couldn't get a replacement one. Imagine that's tough, to find a prognosticating groundhog on a day's notice.
I mean, you could find a groundhog, but one that can do that. I mean, that probably takes a little while, and you don't have time to go scour LinkedIn and,
Exactly. Yeah, it's supply chain issues and all that stuff.
It's like the Pastor Authentic Life. You can't just fake it till you make it every Sunday. I mean.
Oh, okay. I don't know. This last Sunday.
This last Sunday
from the hip.
was, yeah.
So are you prepared to reveal or have you? I can't remember. I know we've talked about it. Have you revealed your next series for everybody yet?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that. So, a week from tonight is Lent. Ash Wednesday, actually.
Right.
And I've got a sermon series I want to do in connection with Lent. Kind of a focus on, I'd say, outreach, but it's not just outreach. It's being more intentional about thoughts and prayers and actions and attitudes towards individuals, because the church is built by each of us, and if we're never intentional about something, then we're going to be intentionally ineffective. So this Sunday is going to be a one-off, and I'm pretty sure I know what it's going to be. I'm not ready to make that announcement. So, but it'll be a one-off, and then we'll start a series, a 6-week series, a week from Sunday that'll carry us through Lent, and so it'll be good.
Very nice. I'm looking forward to that for sure. There's a lot of Protestants that don't really do, or I should say low church Protestants that don't even talk about Lent or Ash Wednesday or anything like that. So I'm glad that we kind of, at least we talk about it. We did the same thing with Advent. We're not just completely dismissive of everything traditional.
Well, the way I kind of tuned in to Lent many years ago, I had a curiosity about it because, like a lot of people, all I really knew about it was, what I thought Catholics did and that kind of thing. And so as I began to research it, it sounded hyper spiritual, but I just kind of had a conviction that, hey, I want to do this. And on top of that, I had a very dear friend of mine give me a book that happened to have 40 days worth of material in it. And that book, along with what I chose to sacrifice to the Lord in that Lenten season, was very impactful for me. And I've participated in it in varying degrees ever since. And I think far too often we can cast away things that are highly beneficial simply because either A, we don't understand them, or B, we're afraid of being associated with someone else that we're not sure about. It's like the Pentecostals and being excited about church. Too many people sit on their hands because they're afraid of being, but church should be an exciting place, and Lent's a good thing. It can really be beneficial if you'll commit to it and seek the Lord in it.
Yeah, I mean, all those, and I think I think it is valuable when you connect to something that, millions of fellow Christians have done over centuries and centuries. I mean,
right.
That I think sometimes we're too dismissive of that connection. I mean, Hebrews talks
Right.
about the great cloud of witnesses that surround us as we run the race of faith. And if we're not careful, we can be, I think a little too dismissive of that just because it's traditional.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things we always like to emphasize is no matter what we do, it's not adding to our salvation, and it's most assuredly not adding to God's love for us. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We can participate in a lot of wonderful things and have a brotherhood. You and I often giggle because this time of year, our friend, a former Lutheran pastor, would always ask us, about our liturgical plans, and we go, we don't have any. Ours is Easter. How about that? Empty tomb. That's our goal.
Hey, look, somebody who's upset when they have to miss church. That's always nice to hear.
Hey, I'm telling you what, that's right.
Well, Caleb, you're in town, obviously. Your mom and dad's, and you're in town for the wedding, and then you go back Sunday, so we get to see him for a little bit. So that's always good.
Yeah,
That's right.
We still, Lord willing, need to find. Hopefully, we'll have time and opportunity to get together before we have to go back home.
Yeah, I mean, he was going to try to come up and work with us a little bit tomorrow before we got, everything
Right.
frozen down and all the schools and everything shutting down. But which it wasn't too bad today, except going over some bridges. So it was funny because I was coming back to church from lunch, and they had sanded it and everything, but there was still like ice at the very top. And these people, I'm going pretty slow, and there are people that they revved up, and then they get to the top, and they're slamming on their brakes, and they're doing this. And I'm like, that's the last thing you do on ice is slam on your brakes. So that's when people up north, they go, oh, what's a little ice? People down here don't know how to drive on it. Like, that's the problem.
No,
they don't know how to drive on ice. So
half the people down here can't drive on rain.
It's true.
Much less you freeze it.
Yeah.
But it's not really excusable now. Yeah, I mean, just Google it. How do you drive on ice? Take it slow. Don't slam on your brakes. Steer into it. Come on, it's not that tough.
I bet it's not this cold in Florida. I bet we could probably go to the beach in Florida. And let me just say, I had the opportunity to be with the Florida family last year, and I've been to a lot of beaches. I've been to a black sand beach, and I've been to cold water beach, and I'd always heard about this sugar sand of Florida. And let me say, it is impressive. It will sunburn you in a minute. Because the closest thing it reminded me of was snow. I mean, you
really?
Are getting, oh yeah, but it's gorgeous. It absolutely is gorgeous. So,
we got people dreaming of Florida.
Yes. Well, there goes some of Caddo's finest out. Lord bless whoever they're going to help.
Yeah, got it in the 80s.
It'll be warm enough in Texas soon enough.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, we could go to Florida and get in the water.
We could. Well, let's get cracking because we got a lot of ground to cover, and we got 3 talkers, so we can probably fill up plenty of airtime. But I guess we'll open it up. We'll kind of go like we did, verse by verse. It's not a super long story, but was there anything? I'm going to put you guys kind of on the spot. Was there anything that you learned that you hadn't thought of, considered, or just stuck out to you from? I know especially Jimmy, you've probably read this story a million times and probably preached it several times yourself. Was there anything that we kind of talked about or that I talked about on Sunday that was new or different or stuck out to you at all? And if not, that's fine. We'll just get into it and start rolling.
So what we'll do, because one of the 3 of us talks a lot. So Caleb, we're always going to go to you first, and then if there's airtime left, I'll fill it in because I love to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, this is actually probably a pretty good question for me since I'm probably the least well exposed to it. First and foremost, I appreciated the kind of connection, kind of the note of where we're talking about geographically and kind of the concept that, this is an area that Jesus is ministering in often. And then obviously he's allowed to go to a Gentile area. You don't really get a lot of that just by reading it. And then really I thought one of the more powerful things was the connection in terms of the length of time the woman had been suffering from her ailment and how old the daughter was. And I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of parallel there that I'd read the story before, but I'd never seen that connection. It seems kind of obvious now. But yeah, I thought that was really cool. And the concept of like how the crowd parted for, was it Jairus? Yeah, how they parted for him and he fell kind of to his knees before Jesus, and contrasting it with the way that the woman kind of interacts with Jesus. I just think the contrasting their 2 interactions was really cool.
Ditto. For brevity, I think we did see that humility is always the proper position in front of Jesus. So I'm going to give it a little tidbit. At Capernaum, there is still the synagogue, or remains.
Wow.
But an even greater thing to see is Peter's house is preserved underneath a glass-bottomed church.
I've heard of it.
Wow.
Yes, they're in Capernaum. So
that's
So
which is
Peter was from
amazing.
Capernaum?
mhm.
Wow.
Or at least his house was there because he was married there. He had a wife there.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
And his mother-in-law. Remember, his mother-in-law was there as well. So his
Yeah.
family's from there. And they have similar things in I think it's in Milan where they have the glass. If you can go down, you can pay extra, and you can see the remains of the church that was built on that spot before the cathedral. The one that I believe it was not Augustine. Maybe it was Augustine. I think it was Augustine was baptized, but it was either Augustine or Ambrose. I think Ambrose baptized Augustine. I don't know. My church history 101 was many years ago, but I think it was Augustine was in that church. But those are always crazy cool just to think about that.
Yeah.
And of course they would build a church on it. That's what's interesting about some of these sites, some of these churches, is even the ones that are around today, they're built on the foundations of several older churches because that site was important, and so they would build a church there or a shrine or whatever. And over the centuries, they would keep building. It's kind of like the same concept to a degree with Jericho, except with Jericho, obviously, there was a, they had a physical, geographical reason to be there. But, if you find a good spot for a church or for a city, you keep just building on that spot.
That's right.
So it's the opposite. It's the opposite of that building near where the old church was that just keeps rolling through different restaurants and things.
Oh, the old Jungle Burger.
Yeah.
Place.
It's the opposite of that. It's a good spot.
The Caddyshack location where they where restaurants go to die.
Several foundations of restaurants if you dig down deep.
Yeah, I remember when it was a steakhouse.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of get into it, and then anybody who's online, we got a nice group of y'all. Please chime in. Any questions or thoughts or cries of heresy? And we did when we. Oh yes, Shamarties. There we go. Yep.
Yes, Shamarties.
Good old Shamarties. So Jesus has returned to Capernaum, and I kind of tried to set the scene because he had gone down to the area of the Gerasenes, or the Decapolis. He'd gone to the Gentile region. And then he came back. He got kicked out of that region because he had cast out the man of the legion with the legion of demons. He cast out the legion of demons out of the man. Oh, look, Jeff is glad to see Caleb.
Always good to see you, Jeff.
Oh, yep. Oh, yeah. Oh, and we're talking about that. Thank you, Vivian. He set the scene nicely. I try to set the scene from the shore of Capernaum as Jesus comes back as kind of this kind of conquering hero. Jesus is not always welcomed, especially in his hometown. Now, Capernaum wasn't his hometown. I mean, he was born in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth, but Capernaum has been his quote-unquote hometown for a while now. And he's not always welcomed in the places where he stayed. But when he returns to Capernaum, the crowd is welcoming him. They're there to welcome him, and they're eagerly welcoming him. There's another kind of word of emphasis before the welcoming in Greek that really emphasizes they're really, really excited that he's back. And it says they're all waiting for him. And that can be hyperbolic, when it says everybody's waiting for him. But as Jimmy and I talked about before, Capernaum still isn't a big town. It wasn't a big town then, so it's not unreasonable that most of the village, if not all of them, showed up for Jesus to arrive. And we get this man named Jairus, who's named, I believe, other than Jesus, he's the only named person. Well, they've got. I take that back. There's Peter, James, and John are mentioned, but other than Jesus and the big three, he's the only one who's mentioned in this story by name, and he's a ruler of the synagogue, which doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but the ruler of the synagogue wasn't necessarily the pastor, but I guess that's the best kind of modern day equivalent for him. I mean, the way they did synagogues is they would have readings from the scripture. And they would have rabbis, they would have teachers who were coming through kind of preach or give the, kind of exposit on the sermon a little bit. So he was kind of in charge of organizing all that. So he's kind of like maybe an executive pastor, one of these big churches kind of role. But either way, he's the one who's responsible for as we see CJ go back for a bath. He's the one who's kind of responsible for the organization of the synagogue. and it's a small village, so it's probably a small synagogue. But in those days, the everything was organized around religion. I mean, it's like those old towns, even in America, where the church is at the center of everything and everything happens there. The synagogue would have been the center of the entire village. And so you got a guy who is thought well enough of to run the most important kind of spot in town. So he could be the biggest man in town. Hello, buddy. So, it's difficult sometimes to give comparisons for people to understand who this guy is. But, he's the big cheese. He's the biggest, probably most important man in town. He's probably not the wealthiest. The wealthiest is probably his buddy, the centurion, who paid for the synagogue to be built. But he's important. He's probably a little better off, and he's got a big problem. And obviously we know what his problem is. But do you remember? I think I mentioned it. Obviously his daughter, Jesus has just left, and his daughter probably wasn't sick when Jesus left, at least not this sick. And in the meantime, she has gotten deathly ill, which we're going to follow. But I think that he didn't expect Jesus to come back, at least to come back this soon. And do you remember why I mentioned that? Why we have some evidence in the text as to why he might not have thought Jesus was coming back very quickly.
Well, one, he already hired mourners, so he assumed his daughter was going to die. So if you believe Jesus is going to heal your daughter, and he's coming back at a certain time, then it'd be odd to do that.
Yeah. So he had already hired mourners, and he thought probably Jesus was going to be down there for a while. And I mean, just think of that. You've got this guy who heals people, who's just left your village, and then your daughter gets sick. I mean, deathly ill. We don't know what she had, but in 42 it tells us that she's dying. So he comes up, he falls at Jesus' feet, he begs him to come to his house, and he's got this daughter, and she's 12. Now, it's his only child, which, if your only child is a daughter in those days, what does that mean, Jimmy?
That's almost embarrassment.
Yes.
But just because of the way they viewed ladies, unfortunately, but also you did not have an heir.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jimmy, so he doesn't have someone to carry on his name, and she's 12. And this is going to sound weird to us, but it's a different culture, and people matured differently back then, and all kinds of things. But she's almost to the marrying age. So
she does. There's no dowry for Jairus. Yeah.
Well, there's even though his name isn't going to continue on with her, if she dies, there's no carrying on of his lineage. Even he doesn't get the son-in-law that becomes the son. Those kinds of things. So obviously he loves this girl because she's his daughter. But there's also something that I didn't really mention on Sunday. There's this added urgency because the implication is, you pretty much had kids until you had a son back then. That was the deal in that culture. So if she's 12 years old and there's no other kids, that might be the only one they're able to have.
And I'm sorry.
No.
One is, the life expectancy was always a question. And one of the things that, I don't know, but it's worth at least pondering is there may have already been a marriage arranged.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And, that would go more towards, like you said, the lineage, but also, the ego, that kind of thing. But at 12, that maybe they were already in those discussions or,
Yeah. So there's that kind of added social element to it that we kind of forget sometimes. It's not just the man and his relationship with his daughter, but it's all those cultural things, societal things that we don't think of as much in our day. So he begs in 42, he falls at Jesus' feet, he pleads for him to come with him. Jesus obviously acquiesces because it says that at the end of 42, as Jesus was going on his way, the crowds are pressed against him. So everybody's there to greet him. I'm sure other people besides Jairus and the woman we're about to talk about who wanted something from Jesus. And now they're all going to Jairus' house to see if he can heal his daughter. So as they're going on, the crowds are pressed up against him. There's just so many people. It's such a small space. And then we have, in 43, we have this woman who'd been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years, and she couldn't be healed by anyone. And I would like, one of my kind of, Jimmy likes to call it sanctified imagination, if Jesus has been in Capernaum for a while now, and this woman knows that Jesus can heal her, I wonder if she hadn't kind of snuck around for a while trying to find a opportunity to touch Jesus. Or it could be, we don't know this, she might not even be from there. She might have come to Capernaum seeking healing. Then she gets there, and Jesus isn't there. Jesus is just gone. Oh, there's coffee brought to me by my lovely assistant, Harley. Harley, would you like to say hello to the camera? There we go.
Where's mine?
Ooh. Look, she did I don't know if you can see it, but she did the special milk frothing from the present from Melinda. So I've got cream in there.
Oh, nice. Look at that.
So either she's from Capernaum, and maybe she's tried to touch Jesus' clothes before, and just there hasn't been enough of a crowd, or she traveled from wherever she came from after she spent all these doctors. Maybe she spent the last time she had to get to Capernaum, and she gets there and Jesus isn't even there.
I wonder if she wasn't from there. I mean, and you guys would know this better than me, but if there's a woman who was consistently ritually unclean for over a decade, and she was kind of getting in the midst of this crowd, wouldn't they be pretty careful not to touch her if they knew?
Right. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
No. You're good. I'm going to drink the coffee.
Nazareth, Jesus' hometown, isn't that far away. And in that region, I believe his fame had already been growing. And Caleb, I think that's a tremendous point. If you're in a village, which Capernaum would have been a decent, but not, it's not Jerusalem or anything like that. This lady would have been on the outside of social everything. And yes, she would have been known simply because, like Josh had mentioned, tragically, much like the lepers, everyone would know who she is. And I think that's a tremendous insight. She probably was for outside of the Capernaum social circles, because they would have, they would have never allowed her to touch the rabbi.
Right.
That would have happened.
That makes sense.
And so she spent her last dime to get there. Mark tells us that she spent all her money on doctors, and nobody could touch her, or nobody could heal her. And that would have culturally, people would have seen that. People would have seen Jairus's lack of male heir as potentially a punishment from God. They would have seen that. They also would have seen this woman's condition for 12 years as a punishment from God. So even though they're vastly different social structures, they both kind of have some shame. Jairus in the fact that he can't produce a male heir, and especially if his only child dies, that would just kind of further kind of solidify that idea. And then this woman that has been ritually unclean for 12 years and can't get healed. So even though they're on different social strata, they both kind of have this social religious shame that they're walking around with, that they want healing from.
And I just thought, there could be a positional threat. If you lose your daughter, and people want to believe that to be a judgment against you, then that could be used as a disqualifier by a detractor or a group of detractors.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be gossip in the town at the very least. If the leader of the synagogue, if his only child dies, so she comes up. I
feel a lot of compassion for this woman. Yeah. I mean, 12 years to suffer through something.
It would be terrible.
Is a huge amount. I just feel, because you have the physical pain, you're ostracized from society. Just brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so she comes up from behind Jesus, and she touches the edge of his cloak, and she's healed. And what's interesting about this is we have many instances of this in Scripture and in real life's the wrong word, in modern day. All throughout history, really, where people who have faith but it's maybe an ignorant faith because they just got saved or they don't know any better. Sometimes they ask just in faith crazy things from God, and God does it. So God, very often, he honors the faith, even if that faith is ignorant. Not from a willful ignorance, but from a young or just an unlearned kind of background. And I think this is an example. This is not how Jesus heals people in the New Testament. This is the only time this happens this way. This woman, for some reason in her mind, she has faith that if she can just touch the edge of his garment. Now, some of them think it's one of those tassels that's hanging from his robe. If she can just touch that, yes, if she can just touch that she'll be healed. And because she has that belief, because she has that faith, even though that's not how you're quote unquote supposed to do it, God honors that. And it is interesting that this, I think we should have a learned faith. I think we should have an informed faith. But God has done some crazy miracles on the mission field and with really young believers. I mean, you even think of like Gideon in his fleece, or Abraham kind of going back and forth with God about if there's this many righteous people in Sodom, will he spare the town? Those kinds of things where they're not really doing it the way they teach you to do it, but God still honors it.
Right. It's interesting because, it's the faith. It's not the width and the depth of the faith that is honoring to God. It's faith. And then as that grows, and it is a beautiful thing because all of us were ignorant in our young faith. And God still loved us. God still used us. God was patient with us. God even lets us sometimes participate in the harvest when we can't even drive the tractor.
Yeah.
But it is, it's an incredible thing. It really speaks to the grace of God, and I think it's very important, like we were talking about with Lent. We need to be very, very careful about dismissing people and things just because of their immaturity. It's a part. I mean, we grow up spiritually just like we grow up physically. We should. We hope. We strive to.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that God honors her faith. She's healed immediately, and then Jesus asks, "Who was it who touched me?" And we have to stop in the narrative, and then they're all denying it. Peter goes, "Hey, Master, everybody's around you, touching you, like everybody's pressed up against you." And Jesus won't be dismissed. He won't be dismissed easily. He repeats the question, or he kind of doubles down. He says, "Someone touched me, for I know that power has gone out from me. I know that something's happened." And then we have the woman. And I asked this question. We don't have to spend too much time into it because it is speculative. But I think it's interesting. In the story, Luke portrays it as a genuine question. The way that the story is read, the only people who quote unquote know what has happened is the woman and us, and that is at least done for a very interesting narrative effect. Now, I asked the question on Sunday: is it possible that this is a genuine question? So I'm interested in y'all's thoughts on that.
I don't know here, but I think it is worth just reminding ourselves of the fact that Jesus intentionally limited himself to come to earth, and that in and of itself was a sacrificial thing to do. I don't want to go back and be a baby. I don't want to live through that again. And I did it, and I'm human. And so the idea that, God would, that Jesus would do this, would limit himself and endure 30 plus years of life on earth. And we don't know what that's like to, limit yourself to that extreme level. But I think it's worth reflecting on from time to time that we always think about like Jesus' death as like, that's the sacrifice. But like also he had 32 years of, back pain and indigestion and, being hungry and being cold and having to walk everywhere, and all of the things that, just generally aren't fun about being a human being. And so it wasn't just, yes, the sacrifice, the death on the cross was very painful. And that was a very, excruciating series of events that happened. But it was also, 30 plus years of of living this life, which is not easy, and definitely was a lot harder 2,000 years ago than it is now. Nowadays, it might be a little easier, with air conditioning and Spotify and stuff like that. But 2,000 years ago, that was tough sledding.
Well, first of all, Caleb, I absolve you of your sin of breaking your mother's heart, saying that you wouldn't go back and be her baby again.
I've never stopped being her baby, so.
Oh well, okay. And I also have to say this. Well, how young do you remember that it was so terrible that you would go back and do it again? You have beautiful parents who I know loved you and fawned over you both. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. We even had it good. I want to go do that again though.
The interesting thing about the kenosis and the limiting, I guess, yes, I don't quite understand it. And I thought you did a good job Sunday. You mentioned it, and we could stay there forever. I think that, the challenge we always have to make sure we stay inside good boundaries is, if you go too far, then it can be poor doctrine, where, God, Jesus didn't forget. He chose to lay those things aside. And that's an important difference, and I hope we get either tutorials or conversations, because that's one of the things that's just amazing to me is how God could voluntarily set aside a portion of an attribute of himself for the sake of, it's just almost too much to fathom, but that's what he did,
and
it really is.
It's been talked about by Christians, and if you want to read those out there, read Philippians 2:5-11. It's the kind of hymn. It's probably pre-Pauline. It's very early. That talks about the kenosis and what Jesus did, and I think both of you, are spot on with the fact that we don't think about it as much as we should. And instead of trying to get caught up in the actual, how much of this did he voluntarily give up and whatever, I think the point more is just like Caleb was mentioning that. It wasn't just the cross. It was the entire life that he lived and continues to live, because Scripture tells us he's seated at the right hand of the Father in his glorified, resurrected body. So he will forever be in a certain way sacrificing for us.
So I had a very interesting encounter. I met a young lady named Bethany over the weekend, and through conversation, she moved up here from Austin, and question is, well, why did you move up here? What was the motivation? And she said, well, I moved up here to volunteer at a facility that ministers people amputees. And I thought, well, my gosh, that's noble as the day is long. And then when she got up from behind her desk and started walking, then I realized it was even more than just a compassionate individual. It was a compassionate individual who was experiencing life. And so if you wanted to just boil it down, it would be Jesus willing to give up his leg to reach amputees. I mean, that's
right.
That's kind of graphic, but it really is a mind-blowing concept that God would give so much. Because if we're not careful, I think we could really underestimate how far and how deep God went to make his grace available to us.
I agree. I would 100%. And I'd also say it's sometimes worth having those conversations. I think sometimes discussions about Christian academic or historical, but when we have conversations like this, without getting too speculative and too in the weeds, it almost makes things seem more real, because that's obviously something that would need to happen. And just having that conversation of, well, what does that mean? And
I lost Caleb a little bit there.
how would that
He's
exactly
locked
like?
in. Look how smart he looks.
God judged him.
But
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I agree with both of you guys. They're important. They're important conversation to have, and if you can be mature and talk about them, and nobody freak out, then that's all right, because Christians have been talking about these things for thousands of years. So the power goes out of him. She realizes she can't escape notice, and she comes trembling and falls down before him. She falls on her face, and she kind of explains all that has happened. And then I kind of doubled down or is focused on verse 48. When in reply to all this, and you can almost feel the tension as the crowd is waiting after she says what she says to see how Jesus is going to react to this. And it's heightened. The tension is even heightened more by the fact that they're in the middle of this urgent trip to Jairus' house to save his daughter. So this isn't just happening in a vacuum. It's, what is Jesus going to say to her? And then it's like, oh man, we almost forgot, like Jairus' daughter's dying. We got to get going. So, I imagine this kind of pregnant pause. And then as Jesus speaks to her, the very first thing he says to her is he calls her daughter. And I think that is incredibly powerful. And I think we shouldn't be too dismissive of that as well, because, he says your faith has made you well, and he tells her to go in peace. So he basically validates her on every level. He validates her. He says, as daughter, you are important enough and valuable enough to come to me face to face. You don't have to sneak up behind me and touch my cloak. But because you had faith, which I mentioned, and I think we'll stop on this for a second. Because you had faith, God has honored that faith. Now you're well, and now you can go in peace. And I think that this phrase that he says, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace, is incredibly valuable and validating. So we can talk about the sentence or the phrase that he has, but the statement that he makes. But also, I think it's important that when we speak of faith, faith, and even this phrase, the faith has made you well, which is used other times in Luke, it is always used when someone has a certain belief about Jesus, and then they do something in light of that belief. They are faithful to that belief, and then God heals them. So the two examples I gave were there was 10 lepers that heard Jesus was passing by in between Samaria and Galilee. They go and they call to him. And then after he heals them and one of them returns and thanks him, he says, your faith has made you well. And then there's the blind man in Jericho who hears the commotion and hears that Jesus is coming by, and he starts yelling for him, and everybody around him starts shushing him. And he just keeps yelling louder. And Jesus heals him and he hears him and heals him and says, your faith has made you well. And the point that I was making was all these people had belief that God could heal them before they ran into Jesus. So it wasn't that's not what he's talking about when he says faith. He's not saying belief that God can heal you. It is their belief, and then God gives them an opportunity to act on that belief, and they do it, even though it's embarrassing in all situations. It's embarrassing, it's socially risky, and yet they step out on a limb, and they're faithful, and God heals them. And I think that's pretty important even to us today.
Well, you mentioned a really good point for this lady. This was a capital offense to knowingly, to be there and all those things. She could have been stoned for conduct. And so we see she was willing to risk what she had already lost in many ways. And it's interesting when I think about that, as far as those that are wrestling with salvific faith, is we think we're risking so much, but the truth is we're not risking anything that we haven't already lost. And it's an incredible thing, how great a leap faith can be, but how small a step it it can be at the same time.
Right. What do you think, Caleb?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's interesting too. Like, I mean, if to Jimmy's point, what she was risking, I mean, obviously by touching Jesus, she could have been stoned from what she had done, but also she makes him ritually unclean and he's going to like heal somebody. Just seems like that creates a lot of cultural issues.
Well, there could have been a ripple down effect. She touches Jesus, and then if for whatever reason Jesus can't heal the girl in the end, well, who gets the blame for that?
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
the lady, she made him unclean. I mean, there was a great big bucket of peril potential for her, but it was worth the risk.
Well, and, I think another point we can make from this is that, there's all these like kind of social religious rules that are put in place that weren't necessarily scriptural. And these people acting on faith, being faithful, kind of break these traditions and norms. If they had just stayed in the fence that society had put around them, they never would have experienced Jesus. And so I think that we need to be careful if we think, well, if I just follow exactly the fence that my culture or my church, my denomination places around it. I mean, God is outside of whatever box we live in and whatever box we put around ourselves. And if we think that everything that is God is contained in our box of faith, religion, whatever, culture, then, we're going to miss this. The blind man could have shushed up as soon as they started telling him to be quiet, and then he never would have been healed. She could have never gone up to touch Jesus, and she never would have been healed. I mean, the lepers could never have gone out, sought him, and called out to him, and they never would have been healed. So, if you're not faithful, if you don't act on that belief, if you don't step out on the water, if you don't step out in faith, then you can miss, what God has in store for you. You can miss amazing things if you're not willing to take that risk. And it is always, it's always risky. It's just, they were risking a lot. And following Jesus the way that he wants you to is probably going to eventually result in family or friends or culture or your job or whatever it is, shaming you or telling you to hush or telling you ridiculous or telling you don't deserve, whatever it is. And so I think it's the same today throughout. You see countless stories of people who are faithful to what God has called them to do, and it requires, doing things that are pretty uncomfortable. So,
well, and if I may, I'd like to bridge back to us. We see this, and yeah, we see the great risk and all those things, but in the same vein, to take a risk, quote, air quotes, for the Lord could be teaching a Sunday school class.
Right.
It could be, great things happen in small fields as well as big fields. And we look at this lady, and this was an incredible reach of faith, if I could use that. But it wasn't the first one. She had been in process. And so this great reach of faith that we see was the final. But I think if we could meet her and follow her, there was this process by which the need, the desire, the faith, and the fearlessness grew where she could be ready to seize that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and you got to be ready because, when Jesus walks through Jericho for that blind man, he's got one chance and one opportunity to seize the moment. All right, so he has that conversation with her, and then while he's still speaking, the synagogue's rulers, someone from the house comes and tells him, hey, your daughter died, don't bother the teacher anymore. And we can just imagine his feeling, knowing, or at least thinking, man, if we hadn't stopped, if this woman hadn't caused this disturbance, then maybe my daughter would still be alive. And then Jesus tells him to not be afraid, to just believe, and she'll be healed. And they go on, and he takes Peter, James, and John, and they've got these mourners, and he has this little confrontation with them where he tells them that she's not dead, and they laugh at him, they make fun of him, they mock him as the word is used because she's clearly dead. And so Jesus goes and he gently takes her by the hand. And this is the second time in the story where Jesus is Jesus is becoming ritually unclean, because if you touch a dead body, you've become unclean as well. And we see this in Scripture where nothing can make Jesus unclean. Now, Jesus will later say, hey, nothing really makes you unclean that goes in. It's only what comes out of you that can make you unclean. So he's already demonstrating that, because the woman touched him, and instead of making him unclean, he makes her clean. He makes her well. And then he touches this dead girl, and he brings her back to life. So Jesus is kind of breaking the mold on that as well. And then later he'll clarify that they're missing the idea of clean and unclean in the first place. And her spirit returns, and she gets up, and he tells her to give him something to eat, and he tells her parents not to say anything about it or tell them what happened. And, then all is well that ends well. But one of the points that I made was that this do not be afraid, just believe. Jesus isn't necessarily, or we know that Jesus isn't going to raise from the dead every person that dies. Jesus isn't going to make well every person who's sick. There are many people who missed him by a day or two that died in the towns that he went through. There are people that, he didn't go throughout Israel and heal every sick person. He didn't raise to life every dead person, even when he was there in person. And that doesn't happen now. But what he tells us, and what he told her parents, do not be afraid, just believe, I think is the great comfort of Scripture, is that God is always with us through our grief, through the tragedy. Whether he miraculously heals or not, he is always there. And we're not always promised a healing or a miracle, but we are promised a God who's with us and who comforts us and who ultimately will completely heal and, all those kinds of things. So that is also something that I kind of wanted to stop down on. It's probably the last point we're going to make tonight, is just that instead of saying, hey, well, you need to have enough faith like these people and then God's going to heal you, it's more of hey, you realize that no matter what happens, that God's with you in this moment, through this tragedy, through this pain. And maybe he'll heal you right now, maybe he won't, but you don't have to be afraid because he's here.
Go ahead, Caleb.
I think that's one of the things that is kind of interesting about faith and about the promises of God is we know what the ultimate promises of God are. But we also know that, like, in the meantime, the focus is not if you have faith, God will heal every sickness you have. Or if you have faith, then you won't ever endure difficult time. You won't ever have anything, go wrong in your life. But the point is that regardless of what we're going through, God is with us. And that, I think, is comforting and probably should be more comforting than it is. It's just that knowledge that God is with us and that ultimately we know, how the story is going to end. And it sounds kind of simplistic, but it can be really powerful when you're going through some really tough stuff.
All right.
And I agree just real fast to answer Karen's question, I agree. I think it is a picture of what God does to us when we accept his gift of salvation. We are made clean spiritually. So yeah, I agree. I didn't even think about that, but I think it's a great picture. And then back to you, Jimmy.
I think it's interesting how man's religion only goes as far as his need begins. Because here's a man, he comes to Jesus, he's he's in bounds, and then he begs Jesus to come, he's in bounds, and then this lady touches him. Well, Jesus is out of bounds. But we don't see that this man who desperately wants his daughter healed says, well, you can't go now. And on top of that, they come to him, they say, well, don't bother the master any longer, she's passed. He didn't say, well, never mind, you can't come now. And then when he reached in to touch his daughter, he didn't go, oh, you can't do that.
Right.
It's amazing how man's religion falls apart when you stand at the precipice of only what God can do.
Right.
No, I mean that's a great point. Is that he? I hadn't thought about that even as well. That somebody who would be very versed in all these traditions and beliefs. When you're desperate for God to do something, that all those kind of things go out the window. And in a sense, he becomes just as desperate as the woman. And he kind of allows Jesus to do things that normally he never would have. And he's reaching out, spiritually just as much as she is physically to try and touch and see maybe Jesus can heal her, maybe Jesus can heal my daughter. And he does. And I think that's a wonderful point as well.
And we were talking about the repercussions of actions. Can you imagine being in the business meeting when this twice removed unclean rabbi heals this girl and you're okay with it? And
right.
And by the way, we have to be okay with it.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, there's so much that we don't know. I would pay just to sit in the room for.
Well, that might have been one of the reasons why he told them not to tell anybody. I mean, he says don't tell anybody what happened. They walked out, and it's one thing if he just healed a sick girl. It's another thing if he raised one from the dead. So, it is nigh on 7:30, and I know Caleb, you've got a heart out because you got another one of these. So
on to the next
I
one.
just want to say,
wow,
I want to say thank you so much for being here with us, and for your thoughts are always valuable, and your insights are always meaningful. So thank you so much for being with us, and we'll let you go and you can get to your next one. I love you, buddy.
Love you guys. Well, hopefully we'll make maybe Friday we can hang out, Jimmy.
Be great.
Sounds good.
All right, love you guys.
Man, I didn't realize Caleb was so big market, big time.
Hey, he goes from podcast to podcast to podcast.
He's got his handler back there telling him in his ear, "It's time to go."
Well, and I thank you, Jimmy, so much just for the opportunity to preach. I mean, it really is a blessing and an honor and a privilege. I hope I know you do, that I don't take it lightly, and it's something that I really treasure. And so I really appreciate you giving me that opportunity as often as you do.
Well, it was a great message, brother. And, I count it a blessing that our fellowship has the ability to listen to different, we're similar in some ways, but we're different in some ways. And I count it as a blessing. I think the Lord has blessed us with you and all of your gifts. And it's a joy to sit and enjoy your teaching. And you do a great job. And you bless me, and you stir my brain, which is awesome. And so it's good stuff. You did good, and I enjoyed tonight very much, very much.
Well, thank you, and of course, all your insights are as good as good as gold. So I thank you for all that. I mean, you brought up a bunch of stuff. Isn't it crazy? Like, I studied for this. I preached it. I talked through it. I prepared for tonight, and then we talked through it. And there's still stuff that I never even thought of that comes to mind that other people talk about. It's crazy.
Well, it's that iron sharpens iron. It really is like four people seeing a car accident from four corners. And I think that's the beauty of the gospel, is it draws you together in that you come together and you reason together and you think together. It causes us to think. And I'm telling you, I don't think the Lord ever goes, "Stop thinking about me." And there's so much beautiful contemplation around what we know. Now we've got to be careful, but I can't remember. It says, if God were to write down everything, where would you store it?
Yeah.
But there's so much that we have not been given that would be so beautiful to make a great Netflix series. I'd be so into it. But yeah, incredible. Just and I want to be that guy. I want I want to want the Lord more than anything else,
Right.
and be willing to risk it, as it were. And each stage of our life, we have to decide that, as a young man and as a father and a husband, and as a man more seasoned, what that means to you and I is the same, but it's also different.
Yeah.
So it's
Well,
good stuff.
I
Love you,
man.
Viviana. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Great crowd tonight.
We had a great crowd, and I'm gonna go and put CJ to bed. So I'm gonna give the sign off to you. I'll let you do the honors.
All right, I get last word. So now I get to talk about the Slinker twins. Well, as always, thank you guys so much for your time. We just love you, and we love being with you and wrestling with the word of the Lord with you. And I'm still going to find Mother Nature, and we're going to fight this out and get this thing over with. But I'm so thankful to the Lord and to our fellowship that we have tools like this, that we can come together even when we're spread apart due to weather. So it's been a beautiful evening. Thank you all for taking the time and honoring the Lord and being with us. And as we get ready for whatever the winter's going to be, remember last week was the anniversary of Snowmageddon, so we're not looking at that, thank the Lord. But I do look forward to seeing you guys on Sunday. Be safe, be warm, be healthy, and until we meet again, God bless you, and may God keep you.